In the mid-1990s, a defense contractor in Arlington, Virginia, submitted a proposal to the United States Department of Defense for a structure so enormous that the word ship does not apply. It was not a ship. It was not an aircraft carrier. It was not a platform, a barge, or a dock. It was a floating military installation 1 mile long and 500 feet wide, standing 120 feet above the ocean surface, capable of housing 3,000 troops, storing 300,000 tons of equipment, carrying 75 million gallons of fuel and 50 million gallons of drinking water, launching and recovering fully loaded cargo aircraft, and arriving anywhere on Earth within 30 days under its own power. It was, by any honest description, a floating city. And it was not science fiction. A technical report delivered to the United States Congress in the year 2000 concluded that the structure was technologically feasible and could be built by the existing defense industry. You have never heard of it. And the reason it was never built tells you more about the future of American military power than any weapon system that actually exists. But to understand why the Pentagon wanted a city on the ocean, you need to understand what happened in the desert in 1990. On August 2nd of that year, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Within hours, the United States began planning the largest military deployment since the Vietnam War. Operation Desert Shield would eventually move over 500,000 American troops, thousands of armored vehicles, hundreds of aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies to the Persian Gulf region. It was a logistical achievement of extraordinary scale. It was also a political nightmare. The entire operation depended on one thing: permission. Saudi Arabia had to agree to let American forces use its territory as a staging ground. That agreement was not automatic. It required weeks of intensive negotiation at the highest levels of government. King Fahd had to personally authorize the deployment against the advice of several members of the Saudi royal family. The presence of non-Muslim soldiers on Saudi soil, land that contains the two holiest sites in Islam, was politically explosive across the entire Arab world. It contributed directly to the radicalization of figures who would later target the United States, most notably Osama bin Laden, who cited the stationing of American troops in Saudi Arabia as one of his primary grievances against the West. The military operation succeeded brilliantly, but the political cost of basing American forces on foreign soil was enormous, lasting, and in some ways irreversible. Within the Pentagon, a small group of strategists began asking a dangerous question. What if we never had to ask permission again? The concept that emerged was called the mobile offshore base. The idea was to build a self-propelled, modular, semi-submersible platform that could be assembled in international waters and function as a complete military base without touching foreign soil. No treaties required, no host nation agreements, no political vulnerability. A sovereign American military installation floating in the open ocean beyond the jurisdiction of any foreign government, capable of projecting power onto any coastline within range of its aircraft and landing craft. If that sounds like an aircraft carrier, you are thinking too small. The largest aircraft carrier in the United States Navy, the Gerald R. Ford class, displaces roughly 100,000 tons and is 1,092 feet long. It carries a crew of approximately 4,500, operates roughly 75 aircraft, and costs about $13 billion. It is the most powerful warship ever built. The mobile offshore base would have dwarfed it. The design proposed by McDermott International called for 5 individual semi-submersible modules, each approximately 1,000 feet long, that would transit independently across the ocean at 15 knots and then connect together at the destination to form a single continuous structure 1 mile in length. Once assembled, the platform would rise 120 feet above the waterline on massive pontoon columns, providing stability even in seas with waves reaching 50 feet and winds exceeding 100 knots. Stay with this, because the specifications are where the vision becomes real. The assembled base would provide 5 million square feet of total space. 3.5 million square feet of that, roughly 80 acres, would be climate-controlled storage. That is larger than the Pentagon building itself. The runway on top would stretch over a mile, long enough to launch and recover a fully loaded Boeing C-17 Globemaster military cargo aircraft, something no aircraft carrier can do. The base could simultaneously berth 10 ocean-going supply vessels along its flanks. It could store 3,500 military vehicles, 5,000 shipping containers, and 150 aircraft. It carried enough fuel to operate independently for extended deployments and enough fresh water to sustain a small town. The base was not designed to replace aircraft carriers. It was designed to replace countries. Specifically, it was designed to replace the function that friendly nations serve when they allow American forces to stage on their territory. With a mobile offshore base parked in international waters, the United States could project military power into any coastal region on Earth without diplomatic negotiation, without host nation constraints, and without the political fallout that accompanies foreign military presence on sovereign soil. Now here is where it gets complicated, because the engineering was never the problem. In 1996, the Office of Naval Research assumed leadership of a formal science and technology program to advance the critical design technologies required for the base. The program examined hydrodynamic stability of interconnected floating modules in open ocean conditions. It studied the structural loads imposed by waves, wind, and current on a platform of unprecedented length. It investigated the connector systems required to join 5,000-foot modules into a rigid, stable runway surface capable of supporting aircraft landing loads at sea. The research was conducted in partnership with commercial offshore engineering firms that had decades of experience building oil and gas platforms in the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the waters off Southeast Asia. The conclusion, presented to Congress in a technical report in the year 2000, was that the mobile offshore base was feasible. The underlying engineering represented what the researchers called a modest extension of available technology. The modules could be built, the connectors could work, the hydrodynamics were manageable. The runway surface could be made stable enough for conventional aircraft operations. Nothing about the design required a breakthrough. It required money. And that is where the dream died. The estimated cost of building a single mobile offshore base was between $5 and $8 billion. That figure, while enormous, was comparable to the cost of a single nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. But the comparison was misleading, because a carrier comes with its own air wing, its own escorts, its own battle group, and its own combat capability. A carrier can generate 30 knots of speed to launch aircraft into the wind. A carrier can maneuver to avoid a torpedo. A carrier has layered defenses, including fighter aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, and electronic warfare systems. The mobile offshore base had none of that. It was a logistics platform. It could not defend itself against a coordinated missile attack. It could not outrun a submarine. It was, once assembled, essentially stationary. A 1-mile-long structure sitting at a fixed point in the ocean is visible on radar, on satellite imagery, and on every targeting system that any moderately capable adversary possesses. It was, in the words of one assessment, the largest floating offshore structure ever conceived by maritime engineers. And it was also, by the admission of its critics, the largest and slowest target ever conceived by military planners. In December of 1999, the Office of Naval Research issued a report to Congress that described the base as impractical on the grounds of high cost and vulnerability to threats such as missile attack. In January of 2001, the Institute for Defense Analyses concluded that the mobile offshore base could not effectively replace conventional sea lift and was less cost-effective than alternatives, including nuclear-powered carriers and existing logistics ships. The estimated $5 to $8 billion, they argued, could fund capabilities that were faster, more survivable, and already proven in combat. Think about that for a moment. The Pentagon asked for a floating city. The engineers said yes, and then the accountants and the strategists said no, not because it could not be built, but because it could be sunk. The irony is that the problem the mobile offshore base was designed to solve has only grown more urgent in the decades since it was shelved. The United States military's dependence on foreign basing rights remains one of its most significant strategic vulnerabilities. In the Pacific, where a potential conflict with China would require sustained military operations across thousands of miles of open ocean, the availability of forward bases in allied nations like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia cannot be guaranteed indefinitely. Political dynamics shift, governments change, alliances evolve. Public opinion in host nations can turn against the American military presence overnight, as it did in the Philippines in 1991 when the Philippine Senate voted to close Subic Bay Naval Base, the largest American overseas installation in the Pacific. The assumption that American forces will always have a place to land is an assumption, not a guarantee, and every war planner in the Pentagon knows it. If you have followed this story from the beginning, you already see the pattern. China, incidentally, has been exploring its own version of the concept. Reports from the mid-2010s indicated that Chinese military researchers were studying very large floating structures for potential use in the South China Sea, where Beijing has already constructed artificial islands with military airstrips and radar installations on contested reefs. The difference is that China is building fixed structures on disputed territory, while the American concept was designed to float in international waters, where no nation could object. The mobile offshore base remains on paper. The studies sit in archives at the Office of Naval Research and the Institute for Defense Analyses. The engineering conclusions have not been revised or overturned. The base is still feasible. The connectors still work in simulation. The hydrodynamics still hold. The runway surface calculations still support a C-17 at full gross weight. Somewhere in the western Pacific, roughly 4,000 miles from the nearest American military base, the ocean is doing what oceans do. It is being empty. And somewhere in a classified planning office in the Pentagon, someone is looking at a map of that emptiness and calculating how many days it would take to move a brigade combat team to a coastline where no ally has offered a runway, no government has signed a basing agreement, and no friendly port exists within 1,000 miles. The answer to that problem was engineered, costed, reviewed, and delivered to Congress over 2 decades ago. It floated, it worked, and the only thing it could not survive was a budget meeting.